The stranger arrived at sundown, when the shadows stretched long across the valley and the air turned cold enough to see your breath. Thomas Garrett watched from his porch as the figure approached on foot. No horse, no wagon, just a lone silhouette moving through the tall grass that bordered his property. Something about the way this person moved made Thomas reach for the rifle leaning against the doorframe. Not threatening exactly, but deliberate, purposeful, like someone who knew exactly where they were going and why. When the stranger finally emerged from the grass line, Thomas felt his grip tighten on the weapon. It was a woman, wrapped in a heavy dark cloak, her face partially hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. She stopped exactly 20 yards from his fence, close enough to speak, far enough to show she understood boundaries. And when she looked up at him, Thomas saw eyes that held a knowledge he couldn't quite name, something that made every instinct in his body scream that this meeting would change everything. Thomas Garrett had built his ranch from nothing over 15 hard years. The land stretched across 300 acres of Montana territory, bordered by pine forests to the north and a clear running creek to the south. He raised cattle, kept to himself, and asked nothing from anyone. His nearest neighbor lived 12 miles away, and that was exactly how Thomas preferred it. He'd seen enough of people during the war, enough violence and betrayal to last several lifetimes. The ranch was his sanctuary, his fortress against a world that had taken too much from him already. No trespassers, no visitors, no complications, just the work, the land, and the silence that came with isolation. When strangers wandered onto his property, Thomas made his position clear with few words and a steady rifle. Most understood, most turned back. But this woman wasn't moving. She stood there in the fading light, patient as stone, waiting for him to speak first. Thomas descended the porch steps slowly, rifle held across his chest, in a position that wasn't quite aimed, but left no doubt about his readiness. "This is private land," he called out, his voice carrying across the distance between them. "You're trespassing." The woman didn't flinch, didn't apologize, didn't retreat. Instead, she reached up with deliberate slowness and removed her hat, revealing dark hair pulled back tight and a face that showed both exhaustion and determination. "I know whose land this is, Mr. Garrett," she said, her voice surprisingly strong for someone who looked like she'd been traveling for days. "I came here specifically to find you. My name is Sarah Colvin, and I need to tell you something about your brother." Thomas felt the ground shift beneath his feet, though nothing moved. His brother, Daniel. Dead for 3 years now, killed in a mining accident in Colorado, or so the telegram had said. Thomas had buried that grief deep, along with everything else from his past. He'd stopped thinking about Daniel, stopped wondering what might have been different if he'd gone with him to those silver mines instead of staying behind to work this unforgiving land. "My brother's dead," Thomas said flatly, though his voice betrayed the smallest tremor. "Whatever you think you know, you're mistaken." Before you continue listening to what Sarah has to say, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and comment below which city or country you're watching from. Your support helps us bring you more stories from the Old West. Sarah Colvin took a single step forward, and Thomas raised the rifle slightly in warning. She stopped immediately but didn't retreat. "Daniel isn't dead," she said, each word landing like a hammer blow. "He's alive, Thomas, and he's in trouble, the kind of trouble that only his brother can help him escape." The words hung in the cold evening air, impossible and undeniable all at once. Thomas wanted to call her a liar, to order her off his land with a warning shot over her head, but something in her expression stopped him. This wasn't the face of a con artist or a troublemaker. This was someone carrying a burden of truth, and that truth had driven her across however many miles to stand before a stranger with a rifle and deliver news that couldn't be delivered any other way. Thomas lowered the weapon slightly, though he didn't set it down. "Explain," he said, the single word containing both command and plea. Sarah glanced toward the darkening horizon, then back at him. "Can we talk inside? What I have to tell you isn't safe to say out here in the open. There are people looking for Daniel, dangerous people, and if they knew I came here, they'd follow." Thomas studied her for a long moment, weighing risk against curiosity, caution against the sudden desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, Daniel wasn't gone after all. Finally, he gestured toward the house with the rifle barrel. "Walk ahead of me. Slow. Keep your hands where I can see them." Inside the modest ranch house, lit by oil lamps that cast flickering shadows on rough-hewn walls, Sarah sat at Thomas's table while he poured coffee with one hand, keeping the rifle within easy reach with the other. She wrapped her cold fingers around the tin cup and began speaking in a low, urgent voice. The mining accident had been real enough, she explained, but Daniel hadn't died in it. He'd been trapped for 3 days in a collapsed shaft with 2 other men, and when they'd finally dug themselves out, they'd discovered something the mine owners desperately wanted to keep secret. The silver vein everyone was working wasn't nearly as rich as the company claimed to investors back east. The whole operation was built on fraud, doctored reports, and lies designed to keep money flowing, while the owners prepared to disappear with the profits. Daniel and the other survivors had evidence, she continued. Documents they'd found in the office during their desperate search for tools to dig themselves out. Papers showing the real assay reports, the true value of the mine, the scope of the deception. They'd planned to go to the territorial marshal to expose the whole operation. But before they could, the mine owners acted. They staged a second collapse, a deliberate one, and this time they made sure to list all 3 men as casualties. Closed coffins, hasty funerals, quiet payoffs to families who didn't ask too many questions. "But Daniel got away," Sarah said, her eyes meeting Thomas's across the table. One of the other men had a sister who worked at the assay office. She got word to Daniel just hours before they came for him. He ran, took only what he could carry, and he's been running ever since. Thomas set down his coffee cup, his hand not quite steady. "How do you know all this? Who are you to my brother?" Sarah's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "I'm the sister of the man who didn't get away. My brother Jacob died in that second collapse because he trusted the wrong person with their plans. Daniel has been trying to keep the evidence safe, trying to find someone with enough authority and integrity to bring the mine owners to justice. But they're powerful men, Thomas. They have connections with the territorial government, with the railroad companies, with people who can make problems disappear. Daniel knows that if he surfaces anywhere near civilization, they'll find him. He's been hiding in the high country for 3 years, moving from camp to camp, barely surviving." The story was almost too much to process, yet it explained everything that had seemed wrong about Daniel's death. The terse telegram with few details, the refusal of the mining company to allow the body to be transported home, the surprising amount of money they'd sent as compensation, far more than a simple miner's wages should have warranted. Thomas had attributed it to guilt over the accident, but now he saw it for what it really was: blood money, payment for silence, a transaction disguised as sympathy. "Why come to me now?" Thomas asked. "Why after 3 years?" Sarah leaned forward, urgency sharpening her features. "Because they found him. 2 weeks ago, someone recognized Daniel in a trading post near the border. The mine owners have sent men, hired guns who don't ask questions and don't leave witnesses. Daniel got a message to me through a mutual contact, told me where he's hiding, and said if anything happens to him, I should find his brother. He said you're the only person he trusts, the only one who might have the resources and the determination to see this through. Thomas stood abruptly, pacing to the window to stare out at his land, his sanctuary, his carefully constructed isolation. Everything in him wanted to refuse, to tell this woman that Daniel had made his choices, and Thomas had made his, and those paths had diverged long before any mining accident, real or staged. He'd built this ranch to escape the complications of family, the obligations that came with caring about people who inevitably disappointed you or got themselves killed. Daniel had always been reckless, always chasing the next opportunity, the next fortune, the next adventure. Thomas had learned to be the opposite, cautious, methodical, rooted, and yet, standing there with Sarah Colvin's eyes on his back and the impossible news of his brother's survival settling into his bones, Thomas felt the walls he'd built around himself beginning to crack. "Where is he?" Thomas asked without turning around. Sarah pulled a folded map from inside her cloak and spread it on the table. 2 days' ride from here, up in the Bitterroot Mountains. There's an abandoned logging camp near a place called Hangman's Creek. Daniel's been using it as a base for the past month, but he can't stay there much longer. The men hunting him are good at what they do, and they're getting closer. We need to move him somewhere safe, somewhere he can wait while we figure out how to bring this evidence to someone who matters. Thomas turned back to face her. "And then what? Even if we get him somewhere safe, even if we find someone trustworthy enough to hear his story, you think those mine owners will just let it happen? They've already killed to keep this secret. They'll kill again." Sarah's jaw tightened. "I know. But my brother died for nothing if we don't try. And Daniel has been living like a ghost for 3 years, unable to contact anyone, unable to build a life, always looking over his shoulder. That's not living, Thomas. That's just a slower kind of dying." She was right, and Thomas knew it, much as he wanted to deny it. He thought about Daniel as he'd last seen him, young and optimistic and full of plans, heading off to Colorado with dreams of striking it rich. He thought about the loneliness of the past 3 years, the way he'd sometimes catch himself starting to think about his brother before remembering Daniel was dead, or had been supposed to be dead. The weight of that loss had become familiar, almost comfortable in its constancy. But now that weight was shifting, transforming into something else entirely. Obligation, possibility, and a second chance he'd never expected to receive. "I'll need supplies," Thomas said finally. "Enough for a week at least, maybe 2, and we can't both go. Someone might be watching you, following to see where you lead them. You'll stay here, keep the ranch running while I'm gone. If anyone comes asking questions, tell them I'm checking the northern grazing lands. Should be back in 4 or 5 days." Sarah shook her head. "I came here to help, not to hide. Daniel's expecting me to bring you back, to be part of the plan." Thomas fixed her with a hard stare. "And that's exactly why you need to stay. If you disappear right after coming here, it'll tell anyone watching that something's happening. Better you stay visible, predictable. Besides, if something goes wrong up there, I need someone down here who knows the whole story, someone who can make sure the evidence gets where it needs to go." They spent the next hour making plans, going over every detail Sarah knew about the logging camp, the surrounding territory, the men who were hunting Daniel. She described them as best she could. 3 hired guns, professionals who worked for whoever paid the most, men with reputations for efficiency and brutality. They'd been asking questions in every settlement and trading post within 100 miles, showing a sketch of Daniel's face, offering money for information. So far, no one had given Daniel up, but it was only a matter of time before someone's loyalty cracked under the weight of gold coins and implied threats. Thomas memorized everything, mentally mapping the route he'd take, the precautions he'd need. the supplies that might make the difference between success and catastrophe. As dawn approached, Thomas loaded his strongest horse with supplies while Sarah watched from the barn doorway. He moved with practiced efficiency, checking every strap, every bundle, every weapon. 2 rifles, 3 revolvers, ammunition enough for a small war, dried meat, hardtack, coffee, medical supplies, rope, blankets, a canvas tarp. Everything he might need to reach Daniel and bring him back, or at least to get him somewhere safer than an abandoned logging camp in the mountains. "You understand what you're risking," Sarah said quietly as he worked. "Your ranch, your peace, maybe your life. All for a brother you haven't seen in years, a brother who might not even be the same person you remember." Thomas secured the final strap and turned to face her. "He's still my brother," he said simply. "That doesn't change just because time passed or circumstances got complicated." The ride into the Bitterroot Mountains took Thomas through country he'd never explored, wild territory where the pines grew so thick the forest floor stayed perpetually shadowed even at midday. He followed the directions Sarah had given him, checking landmarks, reading the land the way he'd learned during the war when getting lost meant getting killed. The higher he climbed, the more uneasy he became. This wasn't just about the isolation or the difficulty of the terrain. Something felt wrong, a prickling awareness at the back of his neck that told him he wasn't alone out here. Twice he stopped his horse and waited, listening to the forest sounds, looking for anything out of place. Both times he heard nothing suspicious, but the feeling persisted. On the second day, Thomas found the logging camp just before sunset. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by stumps and fallen logs, evidence of operations that had ended years ago. 3 buildings remained standing, their walls weathered grey by mountain winters, their roofs sagging but mostly intact. Thomas approached carefully, leading his horse rather than riding, watching for any sign of movement. He'd learned long ago that the most dangerous moments were the ones right before contact, when you committed yourself to a course of action, but hadn't yet confirmed whether friend or enemy waited on the other side. "Daniel," he called out softly when he reached the edge of the clearing. "It's Thomas. Sarah sent me." For several heartbeats, nothing happened. Then the door of the largest building opened slowly, and a man stepped out into the fading light. Thomas barely recognized him. Daniel had been lean but strong when he'd left for Colorado, full of energy and confidence. The man standing before him now looked like he'd been worn down to bare essentials, all excess stripped away by years of fear and survival. He'd grown a beard, his hair hung long and unkempt, and his clothes were patched in multiple places. But his eyes were the same, and when they met Thomas's gaze, they filled with an emotion so raw it was almost painful to witness. "Thomas," Daniel said, his voice rough with disuse. "I thought I'd never see you again." The brothers stood facing each other across the clearing, 3 years of silence and assumed death and forced solitude stretching between them. Then Daniel crossed the distance in quick strides, and Thomas found himself embracing his brother, feeling the thinness of him, the trembling that ran through his frame, the desperate relief of human contact after too long alone. They talked through the night in the largest cabin, a small fire burning in the old stone fireplace, while Daniel told his story in full, filling in details Sarah hadn't known, describing the terror of those 3 years on the run, the close calls and narrow escapes, the slow erosion of hope. He showed Thomas the evidence he'd protected all this time, a leather satchel containing papers that documented the fraud in meticulous detail, correspondence between the mine owners and their investors, falsified assay reports with the real numbers hidden in code that Daniel and his companions had deciphered. It was damning material, enough to destroy the mine owners and possibly bring down several prominent businessmen in Denver and San Francisco. "They'll never stop looking for this," Daniel said, his hands resting on the satchel. "As long as these documents exist, I'm a dead man walking." Thomas studied the papers by firelight, understanding now why men would kill to keep these secrets buried. The fraud ran deeper than he'd imagined, touching territorial officials, railroad executives, even a federal judge who'd invested heavily in the mine based on the false reports. Exposing this would create chaos, destroy careers, possibly trigger a financial panic that would ripple through the entire mining industry. "We need to find someone powerful enough to act on this, but honest enough to want to," Thomas said slowly. "Someone with nothing to lose and everything to gain from bringing these people down." Daniel laughed bitterly. "You mean someone who doesn't exist? I've been thinking about this for 3 years, Thomas. Everyone with the power to help is either compromised or too cautious to risk their position. That's why I'm still hiding in the mountains." The answer came to Thomas suddenly, a memory from his own past that he'd almost forgotten. "Senator Morrison," he said. "Do you remember reading about him during the war? He was the one who exposed the army supply contractors who were selling spoiled food and defective ammunition, the scandal that brought down 6 generals and a cabinet secretary." Daniel frowned, trying to place the name. "Vaguely. But that was years ago. Is he even still alive?" Thomas nodded. "Not only alive, but still in the Senate, and according to the newspapers, still making enemies by refusing to look the other way when he sees corruption. He has a reputation for being incorruptible, partly because he's independently wealthy and doesn't need anyone's money or favor. If anyone can take this evidence and do something with it, it's Morrison." They spent the next hour discussing how to reach the senator, how to get the evidence into his hands without getting killed in the process. Morrison was based in Washington, but he made regular tours through the Western Territories, meeting with constituents, investigating conditions firsthand rather than relying on reports. According to the last newspaper Thomas had seen, Morrison was scheduled to visit Helena, Montana's territorial capital, in 3 weeks. If they could get to Helena, if they could arrange a meeting, if they could survive long enough to make it happen, they might have a chance. It was a slim chance, built on multiple assumptions and vulnerable to dozens of potential failures, but it was more hope than Daniel had felt in years. They were packing supplies to leave at first light when Thomas heard it, the snap of a branch breaking under careless weight, too close to be an animal, too deliberate to be accident. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. Daniel joined him, his face going pale in the dim light. "They found me," he whispered. "I knew they would eventually, but I thought we'd have more time." Thomas calculated quickly. 3 hired guns, Sarah had said, professionals who wouldn't make the mistake of attacking without advantage. They'd surround the cabin, wait until morning when targets would be visible, then move in for the kill, unless Thomas and Daniel moved first. "How well do you know this area?" Thomas asked quietly. Daniel thought for a moment. "There's a game trail about 50 yards behind this cabin, runs along the ridge and connects to the old logging road about 2 miles north. If we could reach it without being seen, we could be miles away before they realize we're gone." Thomas considered the plan. Risky, but staying put was certain death. "How many exits does this cabin have?" he asked. Daniel pointed. "Front door, back window in the storeroom. The window's small but manageable." Thomas made his decision. "We'll make it look like we're settling in for the night, keep the fire going, make normal sounds. Then we go out the back window one at a time, quiet as we can manage. You first with the evidence, then me with whatever supplies I can carry. We leave everything else behind." They moved with agonizing slowness, maintaining the illusion of routine while preparing for escape. Daniel slipped out the back window first, the leather satchel strapped tight against his chest, moving like a shadow across the open ground toward the tree line. Thomas watched until his brother disappeared into the darkness, counting to 30 before following. The window was indeed small, and Thomas scraped his shoulders, squeezing through, the sound seeming impossibly loud in the quiet night. He froze, waiting for shouts, gunfire, discovery. Nothing. Just the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant hooting of an owl. He began moving toward the tree line, every sense hyper-alert, expecting at any moment to hear the crack of a rifle, to feel the impact of a bullet. He was halfway to the trees when the voice called out, "That's far enough, Garrett." Thomas stopped, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle slung across his back. "Don't," the voice continued, calm and professional. "You're covered from 3 positions. Reach for that rifle and you're dead before you touch it." Slowly, Thomas raised his hands. A figure emerged from the darkness to his left, a tall man with a weathered face and cold eyes, holding a revolver aimed steady at Thomas's chest. 2 more men appeared from different angles, forming a triangle with Thomas at the center. All 3 wore the hard expressions of men who'd done this work many times before, men who viewed killing as just another job requiring technical skill and emotional detachment. "Where's your brother?" the tall man asked. Thomas said nothing, his mind racing through options, all of them bad. If Daniel had made it to the game trail, he might have a chance at escape, but only if Thomas could buy him time. "Seems you're confused," Thomas said carefully. "I'm out here alone, checking my land." The tall man smiled without humor. "We know Daniel Garrett's been using this camp. We know someone came up here yesterday, a man matching your description. We know Sarah Colvin visited your ranch 2 days ago. We're very good at gathering information, Mr. Garrett, and we're very good at what we do next when people try to lie to us." One of the other men stepped forward, this one younger, but no less dangerous. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way," he said. "Tell us where your brother went. Give us the documents he's been carrying, and you can walk away from this. Maybe even keep your ranch, live a nice, quiet life. Forget any of this happened." Thomas met his eyes without flinching. "And if I believe that, I'm stupider than you think I am. You're offering a deal you have no intention of keeping. The moment I give you what you want, I'm a loose end that needs tying off." The tall man's expression didn't change. "Then we do this the hard way." What happened next occurred in the space of heartbeats, a violent ballet choreographed by desperation and practiced violence. The tall man's attention shifted for just an instant toward the cabin, and Thomas moved, throwing himself sideways and down, reaching for the knife at his belt, because the rifle was impossible. He rolled as gunfire cracked through the night air, bullets tearing into the earth where he'd been standing. The younger gunman rushed forward, trying to get a clear shot, and Thomas came up under him, driving the knife up beneath the ribs in a move learned during the war, a move he'd hoped never to use again. The man fell, and Thomas grabbed his revolver as he went down, coming up firing at the tall man who was adjusting his aim. The 3rd gunman caught Thomas from behind, an arm locking around his throat, choking off air and pulling him backward. Thomas twisted, using the man's own momentum against him, dropping his weight and breaking the hold. They grappled in the darkness, neither able to get a clean advantage, trading blows that drew blood and bone bruises. Somewhere to his left, the tall man was closing in, and Thomas knew he had seconds at most before a bullet ended the fight. Then a rifle shot cracked from the tree line, and the tall man staggered, clutching his shoulder. Daniel emerged from the shadows, working the rifle's bolt, chambering another round. "Get clear!" he shouted, and Thomas threw his attacker backward, diving toward his brother. They ran together into the forest, bullets following them, tearing bark from trees and whining off stones. The game trail Daniel had mentioned appeared suddenly, and they took it at a reckless pace, stumbling over roots and rocks, using the darkness as cover. Behind them they could hear pursuit, the sound of men crashing through underbrush, shouting to each other. But Daniel knew this terrain, had spent weeks learning every trail and hideaway, and he led them on a twisting route that climbed steadily higher, using elevation and switchbacks to break line of sight with their pursuers. An hour before dawn, they finally stopped in a dense thicket of pine, where the forest floor was covered in thick needles that muffled sound and made tracking difficult. Both brothers were breathing hard, bloodied and exhausted. Thomas checked his wounds, finding nothing serious, though his ribs ached where he'd taken a knee during the fight. Daniel was in worse shape, blood seeping from a gash on his forehead where he'd run into a low branch during the flight. "You came back," Thomas said between breaths. "You made it to the tree line. You could have kept running." Daniel wiped blood from his eyes and managed a weak smile. "You came all this way for me. I wasn't going to let them kill you for it." They moved again at sunrise, knowing the hired guns would resume tracking as soon as they had light to work by. One of the three was dead or badly wounded, but that still left two professionals who wouldn't stop just because the job got harder. Thomas and Daniel moved fast but carefully, covering their tracks where possible, using streams to break their scent trail, always angling toward civilization, where witnesses would make cold-blooded murder more complicated. The leather satchel with its damning documents stayed with Daniel, strapped tight against his body, a burden and a promise that had already cost too much to abandon now. 3 days later, exhausted and pushed beyond normal endurance, they rode into the outskirts of Helena on a pair of horses they'd bought from a ranch family who'd asked no questions and offered food and water with frontier hospitality. Thomas had used most of his remaining cash for the horses, but they needed speed more than supplies now. Word had reached the territorial capital that Senator Morrison had arrived early, conducting preliminary investigations before his official tour began. Time was collapsing, opportunity and danger converging, and everything depended on reaching Morrison before the mine owner's influence could poison the well. The senator was staying at the Grand Hotel, the finest establishment in Helena, and Thomas and Daniel presented themselves at the front desk, looking like exactly what they were, desperate men at the end of their resources. The clerk took one look at them and started to refuse, but Thomas placed the last of his money on the counter along with a hastily written note. "This goes directly to Senator Morrison," he said with enough steel in his voice that the clerk reconsidered whatever objection he'd been about to raise. "Tell him 2 men have evidence of territorial corruption that extends to Denver and San Francisco. Tell him we'll wait exactly 1 hour, and if he doesn't see us, we'll have no choice but to go to the newspapers." They waited in the hotel lobby, drawing stares from well-dressed guests, 2 dangerous-looking men who didn't belong in civilized society. Thomas watched the door constantly, expecting at any moment to see the remaining hired guns appear. 45 minutes passed, then 50. Thomas was beginning to think they'd made a fatal mistake when a well-dressed aide appeared and beckoned them to follow. They climbed the stairs to the hotel's finest suite, where Senator Morrison received them in his private sitting room, a grey-haired man with sharp eyes, and a manner that suggested he'd seen too much in his political career to be easily shocked. Daniel placed the leather satchel on the senator's desk and began explaining, his voice steady despite his obvious exhaustion. Morrison listened without interruption, examining each document as Daniel laid it before him, occasionally making notes, his expression growing darker as the scope of the fraud became clear. When Daniel finished, the senator sat back in his chair and studied both brothers for a long moment. "Do you understand what you're asking me to do?" he said finally. The people implicated in these documents have significant power and influence. Exposing them will create enemies that could end my career, possibly my life. Thomas leaned forward. With respect, Senator, we're asking you to do your job, to use your power for exactly the purpose it was meant to serve, protecting people from those who'd exploit them. Morrison's expression shifted, something like approval flickering in his eyes. You're right, of course, though I've learned that being right and surviving are sometimes mutually exclusive in politics. He tapped the documents. These will need to be verified, authenticated, protected. It'll take time, possibly months, to build an airtight case. In the meantime, you'll both be targets. Are you prepared for that? Daniel glanced at Thomas, and something passed between the brothers, an understanding forged through blood and survival, and the recognition that some fights couldn't be walked away from. We've been targets for a while now, Senator, Daniel said quietly. At least this way we have a chance of seeing it through to something that matters. Senator Morrison spent the next 2 hours making arrangements, sending telegrams to colleagues he trusted, assigning federal marshals to provide protection, beginning the process that would eventually expose the mine fraud and bring down the men responsible. He offered to put Thomas and Daniel up in the hotel under guard, but Thomas declined. We've spent enough time in places that aren't ours, he said. I have a ranch that needs tending and a life I'd like to get back to. Daniel can stay if he needs to provide testimony, but I've done what I came here to do. Morrison nodded with understanding. Then take my advice. Go home, keep your head down, and let the law do its work. I'll see that you're protected as much as possible, but the best thing you can do is become difficult targets by returning to normal life. The brothers left Helena that evening, riding out under a sunset that painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. They spoke little on the journey back to the ranch, both processing everything that had happened, the weight of events slowly lifting as distance grew between them and the territorial capital. When they finally reached Thomas's land 3 days later, they found Sarah waiting on the porch, her face lighting up with relief when she saw both brothers riding in together. She ran to meet them, and Daniel dismounted to embrace her, the two of them holding each other with an intensity that told Thomas things he hadn't known, connections that had formed during those 3 years of shared grief and determination. That night, the three of them sat around Thomas's table, eating a proper meal for the first time in weeks, talking about what came next. Daniel would need to stay close, available for when the legal proceedings began, and he'd need somewhere safe to wait. Thomas offered the ranch without hesitation, and Daniel accepted with gratitude that went deeper than words. Sarah, it turned out, had sold her small property before coming to find Thomas, having committed everything to seeing her brother's death avenged and Daniel's vindication achieved. She had nowhere specific to return to, no ties binding her elsewhere. The three of them, thrown together by tragedy and necessity, had become something like family in the crucible of crisis. Months passed, and the legal machinery Morrison had set in motion ground forward with frustrating slowness but undeniable momentum. Arrests were made, trials scheduled, newspapers across the territories, and beyond reporting on the scandal that had rocked the mining industry. The hired guns who'd pursued Daniel were themselves pursued, one captured and another found dead in circumstances that suggested his former employers had decided he knew too much. The mine owners tried to fight the charges, but the evidence Daniel had protected for so long proved insurmountable. Convictions came, fortunes were lost, reputations destroyed, and the whole corrupt structure came down like a house built on sand. Through it all, life on the ranch continued. Thomas found that his carefully maintained isolation had been built on loneliness disguised as preference, and having Daniel and Sarah there transformed the place from sanctuary to home. They worked the land together, expanded the cattle operation, built an additional cabin to give everyone space and privacy. Daniel's haunted look gradually faded, replaced by something that resembled peace, though Thomas suspected his brother would always carry the scars of those 3 years on the run. Sarah proved to have a gift for managing finances and trade negotiations, and under her guidance the ranch became more prosperous than Thomas had ever achieved alone. On a cool evening, a year after Daniel's return, Thomas sat on his porch watching the sunset, his brother and Sarah working together in the garden they'd planted behind the house, their laughter carrying on the wind. He thought about the stranger who'd appeared at his fence that twilight evening, about the impossible news she'd brought, about the choice he'd made to step away from isolation and back into the complications of caring about others. The ranch was no longer just his, the land no longer just property to defend. It had become something richer, more complex, more alive with possibility. He'd told that stranger to stay away from his land, spoken the warning that had kept him safe and separate for so long. But her secret, the truth about Daniel's survival, had indeed changed everything. It had dragged Thomas back into the world, forced him to remember that some things mattered more than safety, that some fights were worth the risk, that family, even complicated, difficult, nearly lost family, was worth fighting for. The walls he'd built around his heart hadn't fallen easily, but they'd fallen nonetheless, and in their place grew something he'd thought he'd lost forever: hope, connection, and the understanding that sometimes the people we try hardest to keep at a distance are exactly the ones we need most. As the sun finally slipped below the mountains, painting the valley in deepening shadow, Thomas realized that the warning he'd given Sarah that evening had been the last words of his old life, the final defense of a fortress that had already begun to crumble. Her secret hadn't destroyed his world. It had saved it from the slow death of isolation. And though the path from that moment to this one had been marked by violence and fear and hard choices, Thomas found he wouldn't change it, even if he could. The stranger had come to his land bearing impossible news, and in accepting that truth, Thomas had discovered something far more valuable than the safety he'd so carefully constructed. A reason to live that extended beyond mere survival, a future built on foundations stronger than solitude could ever provide. The lamps were lit now in the house and the garden, small golden lights against the gathering darkness, and Thomas rose to join his brother and Sarah, to sit with them around the table and share the evening meal, to participate in the ordinary miracle of not being alone anymore. The ranch would always be his, the land he'd built with his own hands and sweat, but it belonged to something larger now, to the family that had found each other through tragedy and determination, to the connections that made isolation seem not like freedom, but like the loneliest kind of prison. And as Thomas walked toward that welcoming light, he felt the last of his old warnings fade away, replaced by something he'd never expected to feel again: contentment, belonging, and the quiet knowledge that sometimes the people who trespass on your land are the ones who save your life.